They said the year 1843 in Savannah was the kind of summer that bent men's spines before the whips ever touched them. The swamp air clung heavy, thick with the scent of rot and iron, carrying the cries of those whose names had already been swallowed by the earth. In the quarters, the cicadas sang their endless dirge, a song older than the fields, a song of grief. And in a shack of splintered wood, under a roof that leaked more moonlight than mercy, a boy was born. He was not born into silence, though silence would become his companion. His first breath caught in his chest, then broke loose in a cry that seemed to echo against the rough beams above. He tasted dust, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of chains. Shackles rattled nearby, a lullaby not meant for children, but for the condemned. The midwife did not smile. She wiped the child with rags, already stiff from too many births before his, and muttered, "Another one for the fields." At the doorway, the overseer leaned against the frame, his shadow falling across the dirt floor. His eyes were empty, his spit hitting the ground as he turned away. Another mouth, another body, another life to be broken. And by morning, the name Samuel would be scratched into the master's ledger. No blessing, no prayer, only a mark on paper to be tallied with cattle and crop. But his mother, weary and trembling, did not surrender so easily. She cradled him close to her chest, close enough for his heartbeat to answer hers. She bent her mouth to his ear and gave him another name, one she dared not let the overseer hear. "A Johnny," she whispered, a name carried across waters, a name her grandmother once spoke in the hush of night. He who wins struggles. It was not just a name, it was a plea, a fragile spark hidden in ash. She spoke it once, then swallowed it forever for fear it might be stolen. That night, the boy's eyes opened wide, dark as the river at midnight, still as if they had already seen too much. The old women in the quarters muttered when they saw him. They said his stare was not that of a newborn. It was heavy, watchful, unsettling. They shook their heads and whispered to one another, "This child is different. This one will not bow." He would be Samuel in the ledger, but in the shadows he would be a Johnny, the name that could not be chained. And though no one knew it yet, the silence that lived in his eyes would one day speak louder than screams. Years passed, and the boy called Samuel in the ledger grew into his body like a tree forced to bend under chains. By the time dawn bled across the cotton rows, he had already learned the rhythm of labor. His hands, blistered and raw, moved without hesitation, plucking white tufts from the thorn stems, the skin of his palms split and scarred. He had seen children torn from their mothers, women whipped until they no longer rose, and men broken until their silence was all that remained. Yet his silence was not the silence of defeat. His silence was a storm brewing behind his dark eyes, waiting. On one such morning, the heat lay heavy, and the field shimmered as though set aflame. The boy bent to his task, sweat running down his back, the cicadas screaming from the trees. Then came the stranger. He appeared at the edge of the rows, leaning on the fence line, his clothes marked by travel, not by toil. His boots were scuffed with river mud, and he smelled faintly of iron and smoke, the scent of distance, of elsewhere. He said nothing. He only watched. His eyes lingered on the boy, and the boy, feeling the weight of that gaze, looked up. There was no flinch, no lowering of the eyes. Samuel, a Johnny, met the stare, steady and unbroken. The overseer's voice barked from behind, sharp as the crack of a whip. "Keep your head down, boy." But the boy did not move. His hands froze on the cotton, his gaze locked with the stranger's as if some unspoken recognition had passed between them. The moment lasted only a breath before the overseer stormed forward, cursing, and the stranger shifted away into shadow, his boots sinking into the dust of the road. But by nightfall, the quarters hummed with whispers. Some swore the man was a freedman, passing in disguise, searching for those strong enough to rise. Others said he was a ghost, one of the ancestors walking the earth in flesh, sent to choose a spirit that could not be broken. There were even those who whispered the dangerous word, abolitionist, though they did so with trembling lips. The boy said nothing, but the silence burned hotter than fire. For the first time, he knew someone had seen him. Not Samuel the ledger's number, but a Johnny, the storm inside. The chains on his wrists and ankles still pressed heavy, but they no longer felt like fate. They felt like a challenge. And deep inside, something shifted. He began to wonder if his mother's whisper had not been a prayer at all, but a prophecy. Hunger was the one chain they could never loosen. It gnawed at the body in silence, a quiet cruelty that never slept. By evening, the quarters were heavy with its ache, children curling against their mothers, men staring hollow into the dark, women whispering lullabies that sounded more like prayers. That night, the boy returned from the fields, his body sore, his hands split open, the taste of dust still thick in his mouth. His mother sat by the fire, the glow faint against her worn face, and tore a piece of bread in two. The crust was rough, hard as wood, but she pressed half into his palm. "Eat, a Johnny," she whispered, daring to call him by the name she had buried deep in secrecy. "My son must not starve." He looked at her, at the tremor in her hands, at the hollowness in her cheeks. She needed it more than he did. Slowly, he pushed the piece back toward her. "We both will eat," he said, his voice quiet, a vow more than words. For a moment, there was only the fragile sound of fire popping in the clay hearth, the faint hum of insects pressing against the walls. But then a shadow fell across the doorway. The overseer stood there, his silhouette cut against the flickering light. His eyes narrowed, watching. He said nothing, but in that silence was a promise. Punishment would come, not for the bread itself, but for the spirit that dared to resist hunger with kindness. The boy held the bread tighter, feeling its weight shift from food to symbol. He could not eat it, not now. To swallow it would be to let the moment pass, to let it be forgotten. So when his mother turned away, he tucked the piece beneath his shirt, pressed against his chest like contraband, like fire smuggled in darkness. That night, lying on the floor beside the others, he clutched it in his hand. The crust had gone soft with sweat, but it no longer mattered. He did not think of eating it. He thought of what it meant, that even in a world built to strip them of choice, they had chosen to share, that in ashes, something small could still burn. Outside, the swamp winds sighed through the trees, and somewhere far off, a whip cracked in the night. The boy closed his eyes, holding the bread like a relic. It was no longer sustenance. It was proof that fire, once lit, could survive the dark. And in the morning, when he opened his palm, he swore he saw a faint smear of ash across the crust, as though it had come from something greater than hunger, as though it had come from destiny itself. The lash does not merely cut. It writes. It writes in blood and silence, in raised flesh and trembling breath. By the time the boy was 12, his back bore more words than his tongue ever dared speak aloud. It began with one, a thin welt drawn across his shoulder for pausing too long in the fields. Then another, when he stumbled under the weight of the cotton sack. Each line carved into him, like scripture, sentences written not by ink, but by iron and rage. The overseer was the author, the whip the quill, and Samuel, as the ledger named him, was the parchment no one cared to read. But his mother did. At night, when the campfire glow flickered against the damp walls of the quarters, she traced the ridges of his back with her fingers, slow, reverent. She did not weep. Weeping was forbidden, but her silence cracked like thunder in her chest. "A Johnny," she whispered when no one else could hear. "Every mark they carve into you, heaven carves twice. Once on your flesh, once in the book of judgment." He did not answer. He only closed his eyes, feeling her hand move across his scars, and wondered if her touch could erase them. But the truth was heavier. Her touch did not erase. It remembered. It told them what they meant. The others in the quarters noticed. The scars began to glow in their minds like runes, as though some secret message had been burned into him by cruelty itself. Children whispered that he carried the map to freedom on his skin. Men muttered that he was marked for something greater than chains. Women looked at him with the quiet or reserve for those who suffer, so others might one day rise. And in his own silence, Samuel felt the tension of two names coil tighter inside him. Samuel, the name of record, of whip, of chains. Ajani, the name of fire, of memory, of tomorrow. Each scar pressed him further from one and nearer to the other. One night, when the moon bled pale light across the fields, he lay awake and listened to the swamp wind carry whispers. The trees swayed like mourners. The frogs croaked like drums. And in the distance, he thought he heard voices calling. Not the voices of the living, but of those already buried beneath moss and mud. Endure, they seemed to say. Endure, Ajani, for each mark upon you is not an end, but a beginning. And though his back burned, he smiled in the dark. Not with joy, but with recognition. His scars were not his shame. They were his story. His legend had begun to breathe. Storms on the Georgia coast do not always begin in the sky. Sometimes they begin in silence, in the way people lower their voices, in the way eyes sharpen like knives across the yard. For weeks, the air in Savannah had grown heavy. Not from rain, not yet, but from something else, a pressure that pressed down on the enslaved and the masters alike. Samuel felt it first in the fields. The overseer's whip cracked faster, sharper, as if time itself had to be bent double before the storm broke. The men beside him no longer sang the work songs that kept rhythm in the heat. Their silence was louder than any hymn. Women, carrying water, looked back over their shoulders too often, as though expecting shadows to rise from the trees. Even the children, usually quick to laughter despite hunger, grew solemn, their games faltering in the dust. At night, the quarters swelled with murmurs. Some said the north wind carried news that freedom was rising like a tide, that men with blue coats were marching south. Others said uprisings had sparked on plantations farther inland, where torches had turned barns to black skeletons against the horizon. The truth was uncertain, but the hope was sharp, and sharp hope is dangerous. Samuel, or Ajani, as his mother still dared to call him when the moon hid behind clouds, became the center of their whispers. His scars were no longer just memory. They had become prophecy. Some claimed to see patterns in them, shapes that looked like rivers and roads. A map, a path, a sign that heaven itself had chosen him as their way forward. But the overseers noticed too. Eyes lingered on him longer, suspicion hardening into malice. One evening, as the slaves returned from the fields, the head overseer leaned close and hissed in Samuel's ear, "I see you, boy. Don't forget, storms wash away more than just dirt." That night, thunder finally rumbled over the marshes, faint but certain. Rain had not yet fallen, but lightning licked the horizon like a warning. In the quarters, the murmurs swelled louder, more daring. A woman pressed a hand to Samuel's shoulder. "When it breaks, Ajani, it will break through you." He lay awake long after the others slept, listening to the storm roll nearer. The bread from weeks ago had long since crumbled into ash in his memory, but the vow remained. He would not starve. He would not bow. He would not break. Outside, the first drops of rain struck the earth, and with them came the smell of iron and fire. The storm had begun. Betrayal does not always come like thunder. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, soft as breath, quieter than prayer. In the quarters, where hope had burned too brightly, shadows began to stir. Fear is a crueler master than any overseer, and fear had found its vessel. The man's name was Elias, older, stooped from years of breaking under the yoke, his back bent like a bowstring pulled too long. Once, long ago, he had dreamed of freedom too, but each lash had stripped him of belief until all that remained was survival. And survival, for Elias, meant obedience. It was Elias who carried the whispers to the master. Under cover of night, when the rain still licked at the roof of the big house, he spoke Samuel's name. Not the name his mother had given, not Ajani, but the one the ledger carried, Samuel. He sold it for the promise of safety, for the hollow lie that kneeling could save him from drowning. Before dawn, the cabin door burst open. Iron shackles clattered against wood. Chains colder than rain pressed into Samuel's wrists. His mother lunged forward, her cry raw enough to break the night. A hand struck her down, silencing her against the dirt floor. Samuel did not fight. Not yet. His eyes, dark as the storm clouds above, locked on Elias, standing in the shadows of the doorway. He said nothing, but his gaze was enough, a brand that burned hotter than fire. Elias flinched, looking away, but the mark of that silent curse would never fade. They dragged Samuel into the yard, where the mud sucked at his feet and lightning still forked across the horizon. The overseer's grin cut through the rain. "Thought you could play Messiah, boy? Thought you could rise?" He spat into the mud. "You'll rise on a rope before this day's out." The whipping post loomed like a gallows. They chained him there, wrists pulled cruelly above his head, body stretched until his scars ached. Men and women were herded out from the quarters, forced to stand and watch. The masters knew to break one was to break them all. His mother was held at the edge of the crowd, rain plastering her hair to her face, her hands bound, her mouth gagged. But her eyes blazed with fire, as if every ancestor before her had set their fury within them. The overseer raised the whip. The crowd fell silent, hearts pounding. Somewhere, deep in the thunder, the storm cracked like drums of war. But legends are not so easily broken. Dawn bled over Savannah like a wound, red streaks cutting through the clouds. The yard was already full when they dragged Samuel forward, chains biting into his wrists, ankles bruised from the pull of iron. Every soul from the quarters had been driven out, forced to stand barefoot in the mud, eyes lowered, breath held. The whipping post stood in the center, dark with slick with rain, a monument to cruelty. The master sat beneath a canopy, his white gloves spotless, his cane tapping impatiently against the earth. The overseer coiled the whip in his hand, leather wet and hungry. "This one," he said loud enough for all to hear, "forgot his place. Let him be a reminder." They fastened Samuel's wrists high above his head, stretching his body until his ribs heaved with each breath. His scars, already thick and raised, glistened in the weak light. He looked not at the whip, not at the master, but at the crowd, at the children peeking from behind their mother's skirts, at the men whose eyes had grown dim with surrender, at his mother, who stood trembling yet unbowed. The whip cracked. The sound split the air like lightning tearing the sky. His flesh opened, but no sound came from him. Another lash, and another. His back became a river of blood, red cutting through brown, yet he did not scream. His silence was thunder, heavier than their lash. The overseer snarled, striking harder, faster, sweat mixing with the rain as his arm rose and fell. Still, Samuel stood. His knees bent, but did not break. His head dropped, then lifted again, eyes burning brighter each time. The crowd shifted, unease rippling through them. Something ancient stirred, not fear, but memory, the kind carried across oceans, carried in song and bone. The master slammed his cane into the mud. Finish him, break him before their eyes. But the overseer's arm faltered. Each lash seemed less to wound Samuel than to awaken those watching. Women began to cry openly, not in despair, but in rage. Men clenched their fists. Children stared, unblinking, memorizing the sight. At last, Samuel lifted his head. Blood streaked his face, chains rattled as his chest rose. His lips parted, and for the first time before them all, his voice rang out, hoarse but unshaken. "You can kill me chained, but I will die free." The words fell like fire into dry grass. Gasps tore through the crowd. Even the overseer froze, whip dangling useless in his hand. The master's face turned pale, as though he had seen a ghost. The storm broke overhead, rain drumming like war drums. And in that moment, Samuel was no longer just a boy at the post. He was something larger, something uncontainable, something the lash could not silence. They say his body was left hanging at the post until nightfall, chains still clamped, blood washed clean by the storm. Some swore they saw his chest rise long after breath should have fled, as if death refused him. Others whispered that the rain itself carried him away, loosening the iron until nothing remained but rust on the wood and footprints vanishing into the swamp. No grave was ever dug. No marquer carved. The masters wanted silence, but silence never came. Instead, the quarters hummed with a low song in the nights that followed. No words, just a rhythm, heavy and slow, like the heartbeat of the earth. Mothers sang it while cradling their children. Old men hummed it while staring into the fire. And in every note, his name, Ajani, Samuel, echoed without being spoken. Elias, the betrayer, did not sleep again. They say he saw Samuel's eyes in every shadow, heard his chains dragging across the dirt with every step he took. Fear hollowed him until he wasted away, a ghost long before death claimed him. The overseer's whip was never the same, either. Men whispered that its cracks grew weak, that the leather frayed, as though even the tool of cruelty recoiled from what it had tried to destroy. And the master himself grew quiet, came tapping no longer with pride, but with unease. He had tried to bury a boy, but what he buried was seed. Years later, when storms rolled heavy across Savannah and thunder shook the fields, people swore they could hear chains clattering far off in the rows. Not in sorrow, not in bondage, but in defiance, ringing like drums of war. Children were told, "Listen well, that is not the sound of chains. That is freedom walking." Some said he fled and joined others in the swamps, a warrior haunting the trees. Some claimed he died that morning, body broken but spirit rising, carried in a legend by the rain. And some, quieter still, swore he was both, dead and alive, man and myth, flesh and storm. But all agreed on this. Samuel, Ajani, whatever name you call him, was never truly owned. Born in chains, yes, but bound? Never. His last words were not carved on stone, yet they carved themselves into the marrow of the people. You can kill me chained, but I will die free. And so his story was not buried. It was planted, rooted in soil wet with blood and rain, sprouting in song and whisper, carried on wind and storm. Even now, when the night turns heavy and the air smells of ash, they say his fire still walks the fields, unseen but never gone.